A lot of people get paralyzed by fear of failure, and actually failure, I always find, creates change, and change, there's always an opportunity.
Well, the thing is that most cultures, this is why Silicon Valley is so special. The real thing that if it can export to the rest of the world, I think sometimes it gets caricatured here as, a bunch of dilettante, mostly guys, mostly thinking about stupid first world problems. And I think there's some of that. But when I came here, and I think that the enduring thing that this place has, which is a feature, is a bug everywhere else, which is that everybody else points to and laughs and mocks failure. And whereas here, it's a real badge of honor. And it's because people have found that there's a secret that's hiding in plain sight in Silicon Valley, which is that when you fail, you learn. And instead, if you say you're learning things, then the more failures you have, it just means the more knowledge you're acquiring, which means the closer you are to figuring it out. And the people that are the most respected here are the ones that have had some spectacular failures by conventional measure. But in reality, what they are incredible learners. And then, that's caused them to have some huge outcomes. And so that's an incredible insight that it's hard to internalize. And most places just don't embrace that. I mean, one thing about Canada that I'll say is I'm the byproduct of an enormously important social safety net, whether it was welfare, or whether it was, federally subsidized healthcare or federal and provincial subsidized education. I had the benefit of every single social safety net possible. And so a lot of my politics and a lot of my beliefs are governed because of that. But despite all of that, Canada wasn't super accommodating for somebody like me because I was willing to fail. And I was willing to be an outlier. And it's very difficult, to be quite honest, unless you're around other people who will tell you that failure is okay. And I didn't find that until I moved here in 2000, so 20 years ago. Because in every other place, they look at you and say, you should be towing the line and being part of the established aristocracy if you can be a part of it. So, it's an incredibly important thing that I think Silicon Valley got right. Then when I moved here, I felt very much at home.
Yeah, because the UK, where I grew up, was terrible for it as well.
The UK is even worse because, the entire peerage infrastructure and system and, the classism that is so incredibly entrenched retards progress ultimately, right? And you're always fighting a very, very small number, an ever shrinking number of haves versus an ever larger pool of have-nots. And really what they're fighting over is power. Because it's not that they're fighting over resources and money, but they're fighting over judgment, and they're fighting over all these very elusive psychological things. And so the most important thing that the quote unquote have-nots can do is just decide that the power that the haves have doesn't matter anymore. And that deconstruction is actually an incredibly powerful element of societal evolution. And those that get it right thrive, and those that don't kind of just go by the wayside. Ray Dalio has this thing. He had a really good book about 4 years ago. I can't say that I read it, except the last few chapters he summarized in a YouTube video, which I really liked. And essentially, it was sort of like, he talks about these economies and the great, sort of like periods of time as countries defined in these four phases, which are, poor countries acting poor, then, a poor country that becomes rich but still acts poor, then a rich country acting rich, then a rich country that's become poor and hasn't realized it and still acting rich, and then, a rich country becoming poor again. So it's this entire cycle. And when you look at sort of like who's in the ascendancy of power geopolitically today, it's all these folks who have completely deconstructed a social hierarchy from 100 and 200 years ago that they've found to just be really not that helpful.
I mean, that's an interesting point, because something I think we've all seen, and this was your background. You go to Silicon Valley, you get involved in, what becomes social media and the revolution. But that changed everything for everybody. It created a society of which there was no sovereign borders, a society around which you could operate only within people that you wanted to operate within. So, I've always talked about this. You could be a Chihuahua lover, and you only have to hang out with Chihuahua lovers online, and you can hate the Rottweiler lovers. You can basically create any tribe you want. And that's different.
It also did something really very visceral and psychological, Raoul, in that it also reallocated power and influence. And when you see how the establishment reacts to social media today, I would say that the U.S. election is a great window into this. The 2016 election was about sort of, castigating Facebook. 2020 has really been the election of, throwing Twitter under the bus. But really what it is an emerging realization by both the left and the right that social media reallocates power and influence in a way that disrupts the allocation of power and influence. Meaning, it's much more likely, and Donald Trump, I think, is the canary in the coal mine, it's much more likely that future leaders of politics are really people that can coalesce movements online. And in that, you're much more likely for The Rock or Kim Kardashian or, Charlie D'Amelio to be the next great politician than you are, some person who's steeped in policy and who really understands what to do.
But, I heard you recently talking, I think it was on Carl Swisher's podcast, about, that potential move towards centrism, but it feels that it's the opposite. It's a bifurcation and it's a multi-fragmentation, right? It's difficult to get any consensus in a world where everybody shouts. I
think that's true. I think that basically what's happening is I think it's 50% what you said and 50% what I just said, meaning in that podcast. So to unpack it, I think what's happening is that you're absolutely right that social media and just like the way that we organize ourselves now is becoming highly fragmented because you have a tendency, to seek confirmation bias. And what that puts you into is your own echo chamber, whatever that is. That could be, believers of climate change versus non-believers, vaxxers versus anti-vaxxers, QAnon people versus, non-QAnon people. Across any dimension, no matter how normalized or no matter how extreme, political views are, you can find your own echo chamber and you'll stay there gladly because it's confirmatory. But in a place like the United States where there's still only two political parties and the allocation of power is a binary decision between two people, I think what it means is that you then optimize for the lowest common denominator. And the political strategy in the future to win, I'm not saying it's right, but the strategy to win is one of centrism, because the centrist platform now embraces, 50% of the left's agenda and 50% of the right's agenda, because that's the only way mathematically to get a plurality. Just the way that the US is governed, the way the Electoral College works, the way that, these 50 states are really completely discontinuous bodies of electoral and political will.
So it's basically building a Venn diagram and looking for the
exactly
most connections.
That's exactly it. I think politics in America for the foreseeable future is a cold calculation of the intersection of Venn diagrams.
And one of the things that interests me, that I'm sure you've got a view on, is obviously online trust and digital identity. And, because somewhere within this, there's fake news and deep fakes, and, it's going to become an issue. We don't really know how to deal with it yet. How do we solve for this? Is this a blockchain solution, digital identity? How do you see this evolving? Because I think something big is going to come out of this, because out of crisis comes opportunity.
I think you're incredibly right here. My view on this is that we are, and I've said this before, and I think it triggers people, but it's true. But after 2000 and the attacks on the World Trade Centers on 9/11, we had the creation in the United States of something called the Patriot Act, and what that essentially allowed was a level of government oversight that we still have, and if anything, has gotten even more dramatic than it was even 20 years ago. And what it is basically the creation in over the last 20 years of a modern surveillance state. And it's not just an American phenomenon. It exists all over Western Europe. It exists in Russia. It exists in China. It exists in every single country. But we made it okay. And it was under the guise of our physical safety. After the pandemic, I think that we're going to see the emergence of a new form of the Patriot Act as well. Except the key differentiation here is that it will be highly decentralized. And I think it will be individually controlled and administered. And there, I think that there will be a handful of companies that play a critical role. So, one example is Apple. I think that Apple's stance on privacy puts them at the forefront and in a really unique position to help. So how would this play out? I think that what you'll have is more trust, but more anonymity through a service that essentially allows you, in sort of a public-private key model, to exchange critical information at key points of transaction. So, if you wanted to walk into, your offices at Google over the next 4 or 5 years, I suspect you'll take out your phone, that you'll authenticate with your face or your retina or your fingerprint or a combination of those things plus a code of some kind. It'll generate some kind of QR code in real time, and then you will scan it into a scanner. And what that code will basically tell people is not that it was Raoul or Chamath, but it'll tell them that you're disease-free, that you've been vaccinated against the measles, that you've been vaccinated against the coronavirus, COVID-19, but maybe also COVID-22 when that occurs, right? That some other airborne pathogen that all of a sudden emerged, you've been vaccinated against as well, that you've been recently swabbed and PCR tested for some other set of things. And then you'll walk into the building and you'll be able to, be economically productive with your other coworkers. And the reason we're going to go there is because every other person has an incentive to actually ask that the people around them sign up for the same restrictions. And so it's one of these unique opportunities where I think what we're seeing is actually people-sponsored surveillance, where there has been no other kind of thing you could have created in the world that would have basically said, I trust you, but I don't trust you. And so I need a third-party intermediary to basically validate that you are who you say you are and you are what you say you are. And I think that writ large is sort of where we're going to go. I think that you're going to basically walk around with a digital passport. The entries in that passport are not necessarily going to be visas that allow you to go to one country or another, but it's going to be statements that can't be repudiated about things about you. And those things are going to be important for you to conduct your normal life going forward.